So you're welcome to turn there if you want. All right. So as most of you know, we live in a very interesting culture, in a very interesting time, where I don't know about you, but having teenagers and seeing what happens on social media and everything like that is I'm more aware than ever about how much we tend to blame other people. We don't really take responsibility very well for ourselves. We live in a culture that has a lot of deflection, like, well, it's not my fault, I was there on time, or whatever it is. We try to place it somewhere else. And we are quick to often assume the worst about people. A simple example, if someone is late somewhere, then we tend to think of them as like, well, they just didn't respect me, or they're lazy, or they just didn't care to meet me on time. And so that's what we assume about them. But when we're late, we have all sorts of excuses, like I couldn't find my shoes, I got in a nasty fight with my husband, the traffic was really bad. We put all these things in place for ourselves. And so like we tend to assume the worst in other people with their behaviors and assuming about who they are even as people, while giving ourselves a pass instead of assuming the best in others and taking responsibility for our own shortcomings, which we all have so many of them. And I think this comes naturally for most of us. It's not something we have to really try hard to do, to like assume the worst in people. We are quick to assume wrong intent, and we live in a culture today that cancels people really rapidly if you can't keep up. If you notice in the news this week, the Dalai Lama was just canceled. And it was something that he said that, taken at face value, sounded really weird and uncomfortable, but taken in the cultural context and translation, it kind of made sense of the things that he was saying. But we assume immediately the worst about this person based on this one thing that happened, instead of seeing their entire life in the context of who they actually are. Some people are really like, they just show their true colors. They need to be held accountable, because you're like, oh, okay, not only did I see this coming, but you've kind of said these things time and again. And I think of Jerry Falwell Jr., and I'm like, well, he probably shouldn't be someone that we look to as an example of relevancy towards Christianity today, since he has abused and used multiple people for his own benefit. So there's a way of discernment that we are supposed to have as people that sometimes we can be seen as judgmental in, but there's a difference between judgment and discernment, and this is what we're going to look at today. I was at a conference about 10 years ago, and this Franciscan priest named Richard Rohr talked about how quick our brains tend to fire no whenever we see a stranger or whenever we see certain people, a people group that we're a little uncomfortable with, or whatever it is. We fire no. And it is natural for our brains to want to protect us from possible dangers. So sometimes our brains just close ourselves off to those potential connections that we see. When we see somebody, we think no. And then he said how important it is to retrain our brains to say yes. Kind of like what Jason was talking about last week with making those new neural pathways in our brains, retraining our brains to say yes when seeing certain people. And when you intentionally, internally say yes to someone, the coolest thing happens. Like, instead of assuming the worst about them, you begin to see the best in them. With no, we think that they were late because of disrespect, and we make up stories about their character and their personhood. And we become judgmental, we become quick to condemn. But with yes, what we see is walls come down and love grows. Like yes creates a certain type of connection, and the Sermon on the Mount is all about our connections with each other, with God, and with ourselves. So yes creates connection, it creates vulnerability. It shows that we trust God differently. But yes does not come naturally, and it does not come easily. It's like a learned behavior, it's a learned practice that we take on. And we're nearing the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and this whole sermon is about deep connection. And those connections start by recognizing that you are already blessed and loved currently. Not in some sort of perfected state sometime else down the way, but immediately where you are, in all of your mistakes, in all your overspending, in all your insecurities and stinginess and self-hatred, you are loved. And that is the most important thing about you, my friends, that you are loved. And I don't think that we can hear that enough. I don't know about you, but I tend to forget it in my day-to-day life because it's hard to remember it. But God's love for you is the foundation that we build our entire lives upon. It is a firm foundation that nothing can shake. And when our identity is, as beloved, is fully intact, we actually will begin to believe that this is true about us. When we believe this is true about us, then our love for money or our worry for money or our quest for success or our desire to take or control or manipulate or dominate or hate another person doesn't have the same hold on us as it used to. You don't have to live in fear for another moment because you are loved. It doesn't mean that things are easy. It doesn't mean your life is simple. It doesn't mean that storms don't come your way. But knowing that you are loved allows you to then get to say yes to yourself and to others. Not in a way that you're taken advantage of or manipulated, but in a way where you are dependent on God for everything. I was talking to a friend this week who experienced a lot of spiritual abuse and Christian manipulation in her upbringing. From the perspective of Jesus' sacrifice. And she was coming off of our Good Friday service, and we were singing the song that Jesus gave it all. So the sense that we're supposed to give it all as well. And she grew up with this sense that church leaders and parents and people in her life expected her to give it all because that's what it looks like to be a good Christian. We had to follow the example of Jesus, and Jesus was sacrificial, right? But the problem with this rhetoric of sacrificing yourself like Jesus did is it has created havens in the church of sexual abuse and of spiritual abuse, especially for the most vulnerable with women and children. And it has happened again and again through the life of the church. So if we modeled our lives after Jesus' life, not just his death, because so often we focus on his death, which is Jesus gave it all. If you look at his life, what you see in the life of Christ was one that was one of clear boundaries. He knew his objective and what he was meant to do, and he didn't say yes to other people's agendas or their desires for him. So he said yes to people. He saw them as beloved. He saw their humanity and their personhoods and affirmed that, but he didn't say yes to their agendas for him. So he literally walked away from fame when they wanted him to pursue fame. The money and security that they wanted to gain, he said no to. He walked away from power that people thought that would come if he did what they wanted him to do. So when I say the word yes and no, I'm saying it towards that internal person, not so much of the behaviors or problematic things that people do. Does that make sense? Okay, so we say yes to human beings because they are beloved and worthy of love and worthy of connection, but we also practice good and healthy boundaries in our relationships, and that is what Jesus modeled for us. So today we're going to talk about our propensity to judge, because this is just the reality, like how quick we are to judge other people and how this can actually break the connections that we're designed to have with each other and with God, and then how we can be honest about those things moving forward. So let's read the first part of Matthew chapter 7. We're just going to read verses 1 to 6, and then we'll sit in that for a moment, and we can talk about it, see what comes up for y'all. All right. It'll be on the screen, and there are Bibles around the room as well. So Jesus says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." So we'll stop there. we didn't have Bible study this week, so we didn't like really discuss this and dissect it much, but what comes up for you when you hear this passage? It's a familiar passage to a lot of us. Yeah, Joni.
Something that's never occurred to me before is that way down at verse 5, hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. It's not seeing your own, removing that, and then so you can point out, hey, you got a speck. Yet so that you're then in a position to be able to help somebody else with something they're struggling with.
Yeah, I love that. And some translations talk about it as a splinter. And I think sometimes with those translations, I think of like how often, the splinters come from the log or the plank, right? And so oftentimes we see the problems in other people that are actually the problems we have in ourselves. And we're more judgmental towards them because it's something that we're struggling with ourselves as well. So, yeah. Anything else? Yeah, Allie.
Just in your opening and then listening to this passage, I've been watching the 3rd season of Ted Lasso.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like that character in the show shows such a great example of what you were saying of like saying yes to the internal in other people in his way of still being boundaried and who he is so distinctly, but then he also gives space for people to be who they are and suspends judgment. And I think I wrestle with this passage because it feels so much easier said than done, but I feel like that's Ted Lasso is such a good parable that I think highlights what the heart of this passage.
It's a good parable, you're right. Thanks. Anybody else? Yeah, right.
Well, so I grew up Catholic.
Yeah.
And for the most part, you only focus on verse 1 and 2. Because it's like, not your job to judge someone else's. It is, God's job, I guess, in the end. And that's very much the Catholic perspective.
Yeah.
So that's kind of always how I've seen it, is that it's just not for you to do.
Yeah.
So that's between that person and God.
Yeah. Totally. And then, but it seems like Jesus is inviting more of a communal effort than just like you and God sort of thing. But it's harder that way too. It's much easier just to let God deal with everything. And, God does it really well, so. Anybody else? Yeah, Tamara.
I'll just share about the dogs and pearls
Yeah,
line. So it just struck for me and triggered for me, my mom would use this on me when I was growing up. And she would do it in a way like, come to peer pressure. And I just wanted to share that, so I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so triggering.
Anything on Zoom? Paul? Okay. Awesome. Yeah.
So I grew up Pentecostal, and my whole life it was always expected of us to serve other people and make sure other people's needs were met before we took care of ourselves.
Yeah.
And so for 32 years, it was always this constant back and forth struggle because being raised as a pastor's kid, then you have another level of expectation on you and everybody else, these high expectancies of you to be in the choir, get married, be a missionary's wife, have a bunch of babies, and not ever follow your dreams and the things and gifts that God has given to you. And so me going and pursuing my doctorate in music to come back here at Humboldt to teach, everybody's like, no, that's not appropriate. You don't need to be, you need to be here on our platform, only serving God with your gifts and talents. They're not meant to be shared with the world. And so for a long time, after breaking free of that whole entire support system and discovering things like being a part of the Huff Choir in Bayside and taking voice with my voice teacher Annika and having all these avenues and doors opening, which is God's way of saying, hey, you're not meant to be here in the Pentecostal church, but you're meant to go out and shine your light in places like here and other places around the community. So
yeah, those expectations that are placed on people are pretty extreme sometimes, for sure. Yeah, Hollis.
I heard it said one time that, like, when Jesus said don't throw pearls to pigs or give what is sacred to dogs, he's not like denigrating people.
Mhm.
He's saying give them what they will value.
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
if somebody has I'm almost thinking of like DMX, where my dog's at. It's like, like if somebody's like a fighter and they're like wanting to go at you
Yeah.
in the way a dog might, give them a bone to chew on. Like,
Yeah.
something to think about.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, that's good.
like
Things
give,
that are valuable to them,
Yeah, like
that would be helpful.
if
Yeah.
somebody wants the pearl, they'll make good use of it. But
Right,
like if they don't have the mindset for it,
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
that's good. Jay, do you mind shutting the door? Thanks. So the word judge comes from the Greek word krino, which means to separate. So oftentimes we think of judge as like, well, I'm just like making an assessment. But really it has to do with the word condemn. So when we judge someone, it's not so much that we're assessing what's happening or the behaviors that are happening. It means that we're speaking condemnation over them. Like we are assuming the authority over them, like we know what's right and wrong for them in that state. And in that place, we then condemn them. I've heard the saying lots of times of love the sinner but hate the sin. And Tony Campolo kind of quotes Jesus here in a way, and he says, love the sinner and hate your own sin. Like love the person, but what's going on in you? What is it that Jesus is inviting you to shift, to see, to change? And how is the community helping you see something that you couldn't see in yourself before? And I think that Jesus set up his Sermon on the Mount in such a way that we are no longer dominated by, if we like look at it in the format that it's in, it's like Jesus is helping us no longer be dominated by anger or lust or contempt and revenge. And we're no longer dominated by the way that how other people perceive us. And then if our identity is fully loved and known and forgiven and set free into God's kingdom, we can approach this like really familiar passage of this today within like the whole Sermon on the Mount, not just pulling it out of the context and looking at it in itself. Because when you give your life over to Jesus and you follow his way of living in the world, Jesus affects everything. Like your identity is shaped and formed by the reality of the kingdom of God, which is this sense of unbroken connection, and by the love of Jesus. And then Jesus, it's like you've got these lenses of Jesus in the world. But we're really good at judging people. We're really good at judging situations, and we tend to focus on what other people are doing wrong. A fairly recent study by Barna was asking millennials who don't attend church what they think of Christians, and 87% of them said the first thing they thought about Christians was judgmental. That's right. And you might be thinking, well, I'm so glad I'm not that kind of a Christian. Like, I'm not judgmental at all. Like, woo, good job. Like, but the thing is that we live in a culture that is condemning and blaming, and that affects us as Christians as well. The culture affects us as Christians, so of course the church is going to be condemning and blaming as well if we are affected by the culture around us. One of the very first stories of the Bible with Adam and Eve, it's cloaked in the language of condemnation and blaming and judging the other person as worse off than the other one. Like, well, it was their fault. They made me do it. You look over there. I'm good. Look over there. And we oftentimes judge people based on this way to alleviate ourselves. A way of like deflecting our own responsibility. Judging and comparison are great partners. If I compare my sin to another person's sin, a person that I can see is doing things worse than me, then I believe that I don't have to change anything about myself because at least I'm conveniently doing better than that person over there. And I find people oftentimes that are worse off than me. It's that whole log and speck. It's those similar things that we see in people. And I don't think that Jesus is asking us to overlook wrongdoing or to set evil aside or even let it slide. I think that Jesus is simply asking us each to be around each other, to receive each other, to see each other with humility and mercy while recognizing that God is the ultimate judge. In that case, in that state, we still work for justice. We still partner with God to make things right in this world and to fight against injustices. We are discerning. We move with wisdom. We seek the Holy Spirit's guidance. Like, you can be critical of somebody's choices and choose not to spend time with them because their choices literally affect you in a negative way. You can be critical of their choices while not condemning the person they are. So it's recognizing that oftentimes we'll never understand where another person is coming from. We don't fully understand why people make the choices they make. That there's hard stuff that people are going through, and we can look at them and be like, I am so sad that they're having to make these choices to feel like they need to survive in, and I want to see them come to health while not demeaning their personhood or devaluing them as a human being. And I think most people are just doing their best. And sometimes there's things that we just can't see that are happening in their lives. But telling the truth to each other is seriously one of the hardest parts of being in community. Like, being a truth teller is so hard because we all know we get defensive really easily when somebody points out something wrong that's happening in me, or they're like, wow, I don't know if that was a good choice, Bethany. I'm like, okay, let's talk about it. And that's what happens in me. So I tend to get defensive, or we're just so afraid of offending someone. We don't want to lose a friendship. We aren't sure if we're actually clear enough in our friendship to have that hard of a conversation. So we dance around the logs and splinters instead of trusting that even when splinters are painful to remove, everything is better once they're gone. You can live with a splinter for a long time, friends. It sucks, it hurts, it's annoying, and it shouldn't be there. And the longer you wait, the deeper it goes. And oftentimes you just can't see it yourself, and especially if you're left-handed or right-handed, and you're just like, I can't get this out. You have to have somebody come in, and sometimes they have to dig it out with a needle, and it hurts. But once it's gone, it's like it never existed in the first place. Like, you can move differently in this world. So I think that there's a reality of sin in our lives. And that reality of sin in our lives can easily become this huge obstruction to our connection and relationship with God and relationship with each other. And God so desperately wants to help us remove it. And honesty, living in an honest way, being able to say, like, I'm seeing something in your life, but first, do you see something in mine? What are you seeing in mine that doesn't feel consistent with the things I'm saying and the things I say that I believe in? So it's through love and humility, not condemnation, that you help me see the log in my eye, because if I've got a log in my eye, I freaking can't see a log in my eye. It's obstructing my view. And so you have to be able to be in the kind of place where we can have those sorts of conversations, knowing that it could be something that could destroy a friendship. That is a reality for some people, and that is so scary. It is so scary. But when our identity as the beloved child of God is intact, then we just root ourselves in that truth instead of the fear of what's going to happen next if I'm honest of something that's happening. And then Jesus says, don't give to dogs what is sacred or give pearls to pigs. And I think what he's expressing here is that our good intentions, because we all have really good intentions, what we believe are helpful judgments for someone might not be what they need in that moment. Okay? Like, we aren't to presume that we know best what's best for them. And oftentimes people can't receive your advice and truth because there's just no place to receive it. They aren't in that space. And so be thoughtful and be intentional with those encounters. I had a friend who was talking about how it's this guy named Mike Erie, and he leads a podcast called Voxology, and he's a pretty big guy. He's pretty overweight, and he admits that all the time, that's like one of his struggles, is ice cream is his struggle, which ice cream is a lot of our struggles, you guys. No judgment. But he has had a lot of people come to him, and with all the love and all the grace and all the acceptance in their minds and in their hearts, they've told him, hey, I'm a personal trainer, and I would love to get you on a program. I would love to help you here. And he's just like, I'm not a dog and I'm not a pig, but that advice is not helpful for me right now because this is not what I need. I already know I need to do that. What I need is some empathy right now, and I need you to walk alongside of me, and I need you just to care for me in these moments. So I think that's what Jesus is saying with the dogs and the pigs, even though it sounds really, really harsh. Any thoughts before we move on to the next section? Yeah, Megan.
What comes up too is sometimes what some people see as a splinter
isn't necessarily what you see as a splinter. For example, like you being a woman pastor.
Yeah.
There might be Christians that might call you out on this because of whatever personal convictions they have.
Yeah.
You know, and that's also tricky to navigate, I think too.
Really good, yes. Thank you for that. No, that is true. Like the things that some people might see as a problem in somebody's life, I think that's where it comes to like the wisdom and the discernment and being so clear in your own identity. Because people will pick you apart. They will try to tear you down. They'll try to make you feel like your perspective, your experience, your relationship with God isn't strong enough or true enough or good enough. And that's a good, thank you for that. Anything else? Yeah, Jay.
It's so important to be in relationship with someone when you have these conversations, because often you end up learning something about someone's life, and that resolves the need to judge, and you realize, oh, this is happening. And I think that when we're in a deep relationship, we really, I think we can sit and hold that conversation differently.
Yeah.
I think sometimes judging and the comparison with others can be a way to help yourself feel better, but I think the reverse can also be true for me. Times and seasons where I feel more critical and more judgmental towards people, if I sit with it, it's more of a reflection. I'm actually feeling more critical and more judgmental towards myself.
Yeah.
And I think that's a barometer for me of when I'm getting really irritable or having those snap judgments of like what's going on, or because other people, everyone is your teacher, and so that it's reflecting back on my own internal world.
That's so good. Oh my gosh. That speaks to me. Thank you. Yeah.
I think that this to me just highlights why it's so important to have elders that are like really able to call things out in a way that's like putting wisdom and truth into your life.
Totally.
Versus judging you, because to me the sort of like unilateral or equal calling out doesn't really work.
Yeah.
It has to be that wise, like, that doesn't really seem to be helping you kind of perspective that I think is the only thing that really gets to your heart.
Yeah, for sure. I love the passage where in John where the woman is caught in the act of adultery and everybody's wanting to throw stones at her in a sense of judgment. And Jesus is like, well, those who have no sin can throw the first stones. And it says, the passage says that the older ones dropped their stones and walked away first. And I always think of it being as like the righteous indignation that we have as like teenagers and college students and a younger person. It's just like that kind of dies down over time when real life happens and we see that life is more complicated. Yeah.
Because you said that, and I totally agree. It also reminded me of what I have been thinking while you're talking. Is my daughters totally taught me as young people things that I had been judging that I totally didn't realize I was judging. And with their fresh mind, they were like, "You're judging that." One thing was like 15 years ago when a person had a whole bunch of tattoos. It was kind of like, whoa, I had this little whoa feeling a little bit. And then when my daughters were so interested, and started getting their own tattoos, it just really opened my eyes to like just dig into that. And so when I look at a young person and go, oh, look at those cool tattoos, what does that mean? They looked at me like, wow, this older adult person actually really cares about that. So that's a really good flip from being judgmental to learning. So young people can really teach it.
It's almost like we all need to get along together and be in life together. Scott, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think this is body life 101, community and connection. You don't really have room with me until you know me. And that's okay, but I should be teachable and humble enough to go, I barely know David, but David just spoke into my life. And I need to be, that whole receive one another thing.
Totally.
Classic example for guys. Remember that time? You've never had this happen. When somebody goes, hey bro, your fly's down. And it's, I don't even know you, man. I didn't say that, I said, thank you.
Yeah.
Because the risk is that you're fly free for the rest of the day. And I think it's that kind of blind spot, quintessential blind spot guy story.
Yeah, thanks for that. Nice. Awesome. All right, well, let's keep moving on. We're going to go to verses 7 and 8 here. So Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be opened." So I grew up thinking that this was a passage of scripture that had to do with prayer. So if I ask God, if I seek this thing, if I knock, then God will open this up to me, and I will be able to have some sort of a relationship with God that's a little bit more vulnerable. And I think that there's truth there. I think that this can be something that has to do with our relationship with God in prayer. But really what Jesus is saying here in the context of the things that we've been reading about is this has so much more to do with our relationship with each other, about our connection with each other. This is about asking and seeking and knocking is this way that we are supposed to relate with other people, how we approach each other. Like when I approach somebody and I approach them from this place of demanding or saying, this is what I need, or I need you to fill this spot, or can you do this here? I'm not even asking, just like, I need you to do this. It actually creates defensiveness for some people. And if I have a relationship with them and they're happy to serve, that's great. But if I'm constantly telling them, it doesn't feel like it's an equal friendship. It feels like a hierarchical sort of space. So when I ask someone of something to help me or to process this thing with me, it's a request that I'm making. It creates this space for me to stand next to them instead of above them. There's nothing forced or required in my request, because it actually, when you request something of something, it shifts the power dynamics, if there is a power dynamic there, and no longer am I saying what I need you to know, like this is the best thing for you, like I know what's best for you, like the pearls before pigs. Instead, a request acknowledges that the other person has the autonomy to say no, to say it's not the right time. I can't actually help with that right now. So this takes like a posture of humility when we request something. And the church cannot grow and the Holy Spirit cannot move if humility isn't one of our primary postures as people. Like when we have that vulnerability, that humility towards each other, it actually unites us. A request unites people where a demand is severing, almost immediately severs that relationship in many ways. And in a community that is practicing to see each other with that divine yes, that sacred yes towards each other, that posture, instead of that immediate no that our brains tend to fire rapidly towards each other, we can trust, hopefully through time, that our requests will be met with honesty. And if that request is denied, we won't judge that denial, but we will actually trust that that person knows what's best for themselves in that space. Does that make sense? So asking and seeking and knocking is really, it suggests relationship and connection. And that word seeking actually suggests curiosity and wonder. It tells the person that there isn't some sort of urgent timeline for connection, like I need an answer right now, can you help me, I need it right now. Seeking, that word seeking, it actually gives the other person space to respond when they are ready, instead of demanding an answer immediately. So it creates an opportunity for connection to happen. Any thoughts on this so far? There's this group that meets during Arts Alive, a group of Christians in Old Town, and they hold these signs about Jesus, and I believe that they're doing this because they love Jesus so much and they want people to be saved. Like, I truly believe that their heart is in the right space. But if we're taking Jesus' words of asking, seeking, and knocking as a guideline for how we're supposed to have relationships with each other in community, then it's like what they are saying with those signs is what you're supposed to believe. So they're almost like a demand. Look here, this is what you're supposed to do, end of the story. And instead, if we take Jesus' words, then those sorts of signs do not create more deep connections. It actually can stop those connections. I don't know about you, but I love Jesus a lot, and I see those signs and I get a little frustrated by them. And so if I'm feeling the frustration, I think other people probably do as well. So when we go into these sorts of spaces, it's really the perspective of asking people if they want to know more. Can we have a conversation about this? I would love to talk to you about this. Can I take you out to coffee? Can I get you some lunch? And so it's this sense of connection and humility that draws people into those relationships. Any thoughts about that? Yeah, Julie.
With you, I feel the same way you do, and my parents used to condemn people that did that. And then one time with another family, some people were in a Volkswagen bus going, "Yay, love Jesus!" We were stuck on the LA freeway, and I'm like, "Oh, those stupid Jesus," whatever. People with me said, "No, that's part of their outreach," and it made me realize that some people will come to the Lord.
That's right. Some people do.
Just right. So
I know.
it's really
I
good
know.
for me.
Totally. And it's like that tension that we hold of what is it that Jesus is inviting people into, and how do we support, and how do we like point out some of those things of how it works and how it doesn't. It's complicated. Yeah, Danielle.
It shows us like relationship with God. Like if we ask for Him or seek or knock, He will meet us in that. And it just reminds me a lot of Mark. Like Jesus talks a lot about the kingdom of God in Mark, and that the kingdom of God is at hand and there. And will you like seek Him? Will you ask for Him? Will you not?
Yeah.
He will like show up.
Yeah. That's so good. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Good. All right, let's keep going. So he says in verse 9, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. So remember in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus told his disciples that they are the salt of the earth and that they are the light of the world, meaning that we carry the goodness and truth of God in us as people of God. And I think that Jesus isn't so much saying that like we're evil and we can barely do anything good, like, gosh, you guys are barely making it because you're so evil. I don't think that that's what Jesus is saying, even though it's easy to get caught up on that. I think that Jesus wants us to know that in God's kingdom, children are fed, that people are taken care of, and that Jesus believes that we can do these good things just like our Father in heaven does. So it's that posture, it's not so much of like, well, you're just going to mess up anyway, so why even try? It's a posture of saying, no, God has equipped me and designed me to fulfill these good things for people in this world. It's already in me. I now get to live it out as my Father in heaven does to me. And tucked in this passage is the golden rule. And the golden rule, many of you probably grew up in schools where it was like posted on the wall somewhere. It's like the only biblical passage that's allowed anywhere. My kids went to Jacoby Creek and it was all over. Wasn't it all over? The golden rule, yeah. Yeah, it's secular school, but yet there's a Bible passage right there. And we've pulled it out and stuck it on, a Post-it note somewhere. And the golden rule is beautiful, it really is. But I don't think that Jesus meant for it just to be on its own, pulled out of the context that it is. Because it's easy, when pulled out of the context, to deform the golden rule to our own liking and perspective. It can be its own form of judgment, believing that what I would love for myself is what you need to love for yourself too, right? So for instance, if I didn't know Jesus, and as a person that knows Jesus now, and I'm imagining I didn't know Jesus, I would hope somebody would tell me about Jesus, right? But not everybody wants that towards them. So if we place it in this context of asking and seeking and knocking, this relationship of humility and curiosity, then what we do is when we do unto others as you would have them do unto you, we take on that posture of humility. We take on a posture of curiosity instead of domination or competition or believing that we know what's best for you. So it invites empathy and compassion. It invites mutuality and justice for the good of the other person. And also, it's not assuming that I know better than they do, because I get to see them then based on the yes on Christ's love that I have towards them. Does that make sense? Any thoughts on that with the golden rule, or how you've seen it? I've just seen it so many times where people are like, well, if I don't speak this truth in love, then they're never going to hear it. And instead I have an agenda on how to change their whatever it is. So, yeah. All right. Okay, let's keep reading then. Let's see, we're going to go in verses 13 and 14, and we'll close up here in just a little bit. So Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Okay, so with this passage, Jesus used this example of gates and paths because it was really familiar to the people back then. They would have been like, oh yeah, gates, that's all over. Paths, roads, walls, yes. About 250 years before Jesus spoke these words, Alexander the Great, as you know from grade school, ruled northern Greece and went throughout the lands of Asia and just like conquered cities and conquered lands and then set up this Greek lifestyle everywhere he went. And this was a lifestyle that was based on power and privilege, which we are still based on that lifestyle again today. And there was this expectation that when coming into a city, the bigger the gate, the wealthier the city. Okay, so the bigger the gate, the more the city had to offer. So the cities would put a lot of money and expectations and beauty into these gates so people would know the city they were entering into was worth their time to spend money in, to vacation at, whatever it was. And then the people would then travel by these really wide roads into these really wide gates into these big cities, and they would travel in groups almost like going with the flow, if that makes sense, into those cities. Now along the walls, there were a few other smaller gates that would lead into the city as well. But these were gates that weren't heavily guarded, and the way they were so small. They were really only a passage for one person at a time. So if the city was being stormed by some sort of military, they really wouldn't be able to get in a great company of people through these really small gates. It was a gate that you would go through, you would have to do a 90-degree turn to the right, and then another 90-degree turn to the left, and then another one over here, and then you would get in. So it was a zigzag, one person at a time. There was, in my research, I found that there was a small gate leading to Jerusalem called the Eye of the Needle. So when Jesus spoke about it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than the rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven, Jesus isn't saying that a camel can't get through. But if you are pushing a camel through this spot, it will take so much effort. You're going to be sweaty. You'll be cussing. You'll be kicking a camel. They'll kick you back. It's a whole thing. So it just simply means that we are to live with great intentionality. It's not just moving forward without any thought. So when Jesus is speaking about discipleship, which is really this whole thing is about discipleship, following after Jesus, it takes intentionality. It's because we are easily moved by the world around us. And so Jesus is saying, like, instead of revenge, which is what everybody else is banking on right now, instead of revenge, we work for justice. Instead of hatred, we respond to our enemies with love and prayer. And good boundaries, yes, but love and prayer. Instead of greed and anger dominating ourselves, we actually learn to trust in God to provide and to release some of that control. We keep our word as honest and trustworthy people. And if you notice throughout the Sermon on the Mount, there's nothing in here about not drinking, or not smoking, or not partying, or not cussing, or whatever it is that we've placed on these rules as kids in the Bible. That's not really what this thing is about. While it's good for us to take care of your bodies, it's important to be aware of those things and take care of your bodies and live with intention. Jesus is so clear about our identity. That's what he wants us to recognize, that we are the beloved children of God, that is the most true thing about us, and then that flows into everything that we do and everything that we say. So the narrow road is a road of intention that always leads to life now, today. And staying on that wide flow of culture oftentimes means that we get lumped into these groups, this think tank of social media and regular media talking heads that make us judge somebody really quickly. It makes us cancel people, and it causes us to think that they deserve to be condemned. There's an author by the name of Amy Jo Levine, and she writes, and we'll put it up here, "The easy path tempts. It is easier to hate one's enemies than to love them. It is easier to sue someone than to work towards reconciliation. It is easier to be judgmental than to be humble. No one said the path into the kingdom would be easy. It is hard work to follow Jesus sometimes. And some of you want to take that easy road out because this last few years have been really hard. There are a lot of things that have happened in our lives that feel almost totally impossible. And you've felt spiritually attacked. You have been misunderstood. You've felt the judgment of others. And there's this desire, I think, for ease in each of us that we want to, jump ship. We want to numb out and avoid discomfort. And we want to take that wide road of indifference. We want to ignore injustice because it's just so heavy in our regular day-to-day lives that to work towards something else feels impossible. Or we want to hold onto grudges and blame other people for our behaviors, and we want to deflect our responsibility and just do the bare minimum because everything else feels like it's too much right now. And you might feel really alone in it. That word for narrow in the Greek is phlebo, which means hard pressed. And it's a term for crushing grapes. Like when everything feels hard pressed and crushed out of you, it's like you feel like you're not going to make it through this hard season of following Jesus, and it just feels really freaking impossible. That crushing. Paul uses this word in 2 Corinthians, and it'll be on the screen. But 2 Corinthians chapter 2, in verse 4, 2 Corinthians 4, verse 7, he says that we have this treasure, being like Jesus, this treasure of Jesus, in jars of clay, and those jars of clay is like our lives, to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed, phlebo, on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. If you are feeling crushed, like when you feel like life is impossible sometimes, you are not alone in this season, friends. Like that narrow way is a way where Jesus goes with you through that valley of the shadow of death, that way that we would rather just numb out or not engage or avoid the discomfort of life. Like with Jesus, we get to fully engage with it and know that we're not alone, that we have each other as well. And this narrow way leads not only to life now, but it leads to eternal life with Jesus forever. And on the second Sunday of Easter, we recognize that even though Jesus rose from the dead, resurrection does not eliminate struggles in life. I wish it did. It does not. But in those struggles, we are not alone. That is a promise that I hold so fast to. I've felt it here with all of you, and I've felt it with Christ again and again. I want to end on this passage from 2 Corinthians, and Paul goes on to verse 16 to 18. He says, "Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles," which, friends, he is writing this from prison. He is beaten. He is starving to death. This is not a light or momentary trouble for him, and yet he still says, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." Oof. Jesus, I thank you that you are with us through all of these things. That you have given us guidance, that your Holy Spirit directs us, that you give us the wisdom to discern really hard things in ourselves and in each other. Jesus, I thank you that you affirm us as loved. May we receive that truth. And when we forget it, because we do, will you place these amazing people around us to remind us of who we actually are? Lord, help us to see the yes in each other. Help us undo those no's. May we see each person as beloved. We love you, Jesus, and we thank you that you are with us through all things. In your name we pray. Amen.